and welcome to Dialogue. This year's Munich Security Conference highlights the growing trend of multipolarization, where global power is becoming more decentralized and new alliances and partnerships are continuing to emerge. The conference serves as a platform for decision makers and thought leaders from around the world to tackle pressing security challenges and explore potential solutions. At this critical juncture of multipolarity, what role will the major powers play, and how are global relations being shaped as conservative voices gain strength and traditional norms such as adherence to the rule of law appear to weaken? Join us for today's discussion. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me today are Professor Cui Hongjian from Academy of Regional and Global Governance at Beijing Foreign Studies University, Professor Peter Kuznick from Department of History at American University, and Pieter Cleppe, Editor-in-Chief of Brusselsreport.eu. Welcome to Dialogue. So, Professor Peter Kuznick, or Peter from Washington, I'll start with you. So the Munich Security Report argues that the extent to which today's world is already multipolar is debatable, but that the world's multipolarization is a fact. So I want you to tell us, especially our viewers who are not familiar with these terms or international relations theories, tell us what is multipolarization? How different is it from, let's say, people's understanding of the international order right now, maybe?
It's a fundamental change from the world that has existed before. Back in 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the leading neocon theorist Charles Krauthammer said this was America's unipolar moment and would last 30 or 40 years and nobody would be able to challenge the United States in any way in any part of the world. Then in 2002, after the invasion of Afghanistan, Krauthammer said this is the unipolar era and would last indefinitely. Well, things went awry in Iraq and Afghanistan, and by 2006, even Krauthammer announced that the unipolar apogee had passed. Well, since then, we've seen other things develop, especially the rise of China. And so in 2018, the United States announced that global terrorism is no longer the main threat to U.S. security, but Russia and China, and that China is the pacing threat. And what we've seen happening in recent years is more and more power being dispersed globally. Whereas now China is not only the leading trading partner of most nations in the world, China has developed a military, while not quite on a par with the U.S., is a military that can threaten the U.S., certainly in the Indo-Pacific, in Asia. And Russia is still a nuclear superpower on a par with the U.S. On top of that, we've got the emergence of India, which now is the world's biggest population, is growing economically, Brazil, Japan, France, Germany. So some people say it's still a unipolar system dominated by the U.S. Some say it's a bipolar system dominated by the U.S. and China. Some say tripolar, U.S., China, and Russia. And then some say multipolar. So that's what the debate is about. But clearly, the U.S. position as the dominant global hegemon is no longer effective in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Hongjian, from Beijing's point of view, how do you look at this process, I would say, of becoming a multipolar world or increasingly multipolar?
Indeed, as we know, the multipolar world is not a new issue. For a long time, especially after the end of the Cold War, the people are talking about the possibility or tendencies for a more multipolar world. But of course, as we know, after the Cold War, indeed, there is a unipolar world dominated by the United States. But now I think that, especially recent years, mostly for some long-Western countries, they are talking about the not only tendencies and also the fact of the multipolar world. I think which means that, firstly, more equal distribution of global wealthy because of economic globalization. So we are find out some more emerging economies, including China, some other BRICS member states. And then, how about this balancing of a power structure, especially now, the United States is trying to give up to some degree its responsibility as a dominating state in the international community. So I think it also gives some more space for some other countries, some other actors to play a more active role to shoulder some more responsibilities.
Peter, from the Brussels, if you look at the report, multipolarization, also means that the world is experiencing increasing polarization between and within many states. What's your observation?
Well, I think there's definitely a consensus that the world is more multipolar than after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when you had the United States as the unrivaled dominant power. But to be fair, there's still a lot of debate on a number of issues. First of all, Russia. To what extent is Russia a serious military challenge for the United States? I think opinions are divided on that. Some people say that, especially after the experience in Ukraine, it's clear that the Russian army is not what it's cracked up to be. Not everybody agrees with that, of course. The United States, I think, is still number one. And even people that agree that we now have a powerful China and India and Russia next to it will have to agree with that. More importantly, if you look at the future at demography, there's a number of people who say that the position of the United States is actually going to strengthen rather than weaken, despite the massive debt that the United States has, despite the massive challenges that the government there is not properly tackling, despite all these handicaps. There's still a lot of people very optimistic about the United States.
Mm-hmm. Professor Kuznick, if you look at the U.S. in particular, President Trump, of course, since he took office, since then, what happened over the past around 3 weeks? Some say for U.S. President Donald Trump and his supporters, the post-war international order constitutes a bad deal. And probably that explains why, he talked about in his inaugural speech about expanding territories of the United States and, Canada, Greenland, Panama Canal, Gaza recently. What do you make of that?
I think Trump is a wild card. He's going after America's traditional enemies first, like Canada, Mexico, Panama, Greenland, Colombia. It seems very bizarre. And he's threatening to use force to expand the United States in certain areas. The tariffs he's imposed are greater so far on Mexico and Canada than on China. So with Trump in control, the United States does not view the world the way it has traditionally. You go back to 1948, and George Kennan, the architect of the Cold War, writes an important memo. He says, we've got 6.3% of the world's population, yet we control 50% of the world's wealth. We can't help but be the object of envy and resentment. The challenge for us is to maintain this position of disparity in the coming period. Well, and then to do that, the United States created alliances and certain economic patterns that would keep the United States on top. Donald Trump doesn't seem to understand that world, even from a U.S. dominance position. So the Trump perspective is that if anybody's got a trade deficit or a trade surplus with the U.S., they're exploiting the United States. He doesn't see the need for alliances. Biden was the great alliance rebuilder, not to the detriment of the world, I think. Now Trump is coming in there, and he's going after America's friends, and now he's really trying in many ways to dismantle the global structure that the U.S. has created, certainly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, but even throughout the Cold War. So we're in a new uncharted territory globally now. One of the things the report stresses is that the U.S. is no longer going to play the role of the guarantor of the liberal international order. And what is that going to mean? It's going to certainly create room for China to emerge even more than it has, and potentially for India and other countries as well. So we're at a moment now, an inflection point. We're going forward. We're not sure what this world is going to look like, this new multipolar world. It's got a lot of great potential with the emergence of the global south and the BRICS and others, but it's also fraught with a lot of dangers, as the report also indicates.
So back to Peter in Brussels. Peter, of course, I think a few people would disagree with you. Probably the U.S. remains the dominant power, and looking ahead, probably obviously the number one, the most powerful country in the world. But if you look at the performance of Donald Trump so far, his tariffs basically on everybody else, the EU, China, Canada, Mexico, steel and aluminum, and also his claim of territories like Greenland. What does that mean to the European Union, for example? Very important, the second largest economy in the world, or the largest.
Well, yes, European governments are, of course, greatly concerned by these moves from Trump. And there's even been talk of sending European soldiers to Greenland. I think it's just talk, because everybody's basically looking to see what Trump is actually trying to achieve. Personally, I tend to be leaning to the optimistic side. I think if you look at the experience now with Colombia, Mexico, and Canada, in those three cases, Trump has basically obtained some kind of a win, and in return, he has suspended his punitive measures, or at least most of it, which I think should make one more optimistic on what Trump will achieve with China, with Europe, with others. And I think should basically lead to the conclusion that Trump is not really all that keen on tariffs, but that he may basically uses the threat of tariffs to achieve certain unrelated policy objectives. Now, that is an optimistic reading. I may be completely wrong here. Last time around, some of the tariffs were actually implemented. Also, Trump's strategy may work at the beginning, but may not continue to work. So I think all in all, it's quite risky. But what is for sure, I think, is that you can always talk to Trump. You can always make a deal of some kind. And at the end of the day, that is very important, I think.
Well, Hongjian, the Munich Security Report noted that Trump's presidential victory has buried the U.S. post-Cold War foreign policy consensus. The report says Trump's idea of absorbing Greenland, Panama, and Canada suggests he will not feel bound by key international norms. Now, here is a key point of whether big powers will be bound by the international rules or the current international rules. Do we still have the respect for national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and those very important international rules based on which we conduct the relationship?
We can understand the very deep worry from European side from this Munich Security Conference report. Indeed, because of from the regard of the European side, that President Trump and his United States is trying to change fundamentally, the international law and also the principle of American foreign policy, especially also in the recent years, not only in the United States and also in Europe. Some politicians are talking about the approach of the foreign policy to go back to the future. How could we understand go back to the future? Which means that they will give up some international norms. For example, in the name of liberty or in the name of internationalism. And they will have go back to this more realistic so-called mindset of the relations. So if we look at this requirement from Trump administration on Panama Canal and Greenland or some other. I think it's just a kind of a new type of expansionism, and also maybe a new vision, a new version for this Monroe Doctrine. As we know, earlier in the 19th century, when United States just started its expansion in North America. But of course, this time, the whole vision from for a Trump administration is a global level and is a world. So I think now, yes, it's a very, very big challenge, not only for Europe and also for China, some other, international community to understand we should just follow this tendency led by United States, by Trump administration to reversion the international law, which means that, okay, once I got the power, once I got the capability, I can decide the fortune or doctrine for some other countries. So I think yes, it gave a very very big question for European, side that even Europe is trying to opposing this kind of expansionism of Russia, but indeed from United States, from Washington, there is another kind of expansionism, and even I think most ironically is because it's from Washington. So for Europe, for some allies of the United States, it's more difficult to deal with it.
For U.S. allies and more difficult to deal with it. Professor Kuznick, if you look at the norms, things like that, people would wonder, what is the ultimate goal of Donald Trump? Is he serious in acquiring, for example, Canada as 51st states of the United States? I mean, how serious is he? What is in his mind? Looking at expanding territories or. What will he do?
I think he's serious, but I think we have to be careful not to take him literally. And he's not governed by ideological principles. As Peter was saying, he's pragmatic. He's a deal maker. You can make deals with him. He'll talk to anybody, which is much better in some ways than what we've had before. So, but he also is a bully. He likes to use power, likes to threaten people. He does not believe, like the Chinese, in win-win diplomacy. He approaches it as a zero-sum game. We win, you lose, my ego is gratified. But he's surrounded by neoconservative hawks. You look at the Marco Rubios and the Mike Walzes and the Sebastian Gorkas and the Pete Hegseths and so many of the other advisors around Trump. These are more traditional neoconservative hawks. And so the question for Trump is often, who's the last person in the room with him? Who's got his ear? And who's going to help shape the way he approaches things? So that's why in some ways there is more potential with the Trump for finding peaceful solutions. There's also more potential for somebody being rash, impulsive, knee-jerk, and in some ways threatening and bullying, and even potentially resorting to force. He'd rather use economic coercion than military coercion as his instinct, which I think is a good thing. But from the standpoint of looking at the world from a win-win perspective in which we can all prosper and have peaceful relations, that's not the world that Donald Trump, I think, is likely to create.
Yeah, move on to Peter in Brussels. Look, I think another topic, obviously, at Munich Security Report, the meeting, the conference will be the Ukraine issue. I think there are, all kinds of leaks in the media, like what kind of a deal that will be produced from Washington. Some have that, Ukraine will recognize the territories captured by the Russians, etc., and there's no joining NATO for the future. So what is the response from the European countries? What kind of role they can play, especially when they look at, the discussion is basically between Moscow and Washington. It's beyond Ukraine, it's beyond the European Union.
Well, European countries are divided on Ukraine to start. There's, for example, Poland, Finland. I think they would not be happy with a dirty deal between Putin and Trump on Ukraine. Others, like for example Italy, I think would be more happy with some temporary solution for this conflict. It's pretty clear what Trump wants. He basically wants to tell Putin, look, you can keep what you stole, but you have to stop the war now. And there's going to be peacekeepers, and the United States is going to, give security guarantees to Ukraine, but they're not going to be part of NATO. They may become part of the EU if the EU wants it at some point, and European countries need to pay for some of the reconstruction of Ukraine, and need to deliver peacekeepers in some buffer zone. So that's sort of the idea. Now, I do think Trump may be mistaken that this is in the interests of Putin, because, I mean, Putin is in a corner. I mean, he has cornered himself into that corner. So is it really in his interest to stop this war? This war is very convenient to divert attention from all the things that are going wrong back home in Russia. Now, to continue with the war is maybe not an obvious ideal situation for Putin either. So I think this period is going to be very interesting, and I can just hope that Trump realizes that for Putin this is not an obvious win, that his plan may well completely fail. I just think that if things get really difficult, I wouldn't be surprised that Trump turns to China to help him convince Putin to go with his plan.
Well, Hongjian, why there's still this accusation that China is siding with Russia? Somehow, only China can pressure Moscow to withdraw from Ukraine?
Indeed, firstly, I don't think that China is siding with Russia. I think if we look at the traditional understanding about once some European and American people believe that China and Russia are already the allies, how could China do as an ally of Russia? Not only just like this time, I think that China will support Russia clearly and openly. But so far as we know, China does not do anything to violate its principle to keep, I would like to say, a balancing position between Russia and Ukraine. Indeed, both Russia and Ukraine, they are, strategic partners with China. So indeed, I think China itself is also a victim for this current conflict between two countries. Yes, we are talking about the BRI or some other corporations between China and Russia, between China and Ukraine. China suffered a lot from this conflict. So far, the transportation and also normal trade between China and Europe got a lot of lost from this conflict. So yes, I think that China will try to play a more active role to help the situation. Once there are some more conditions for political settlement in this crisis, I think China will not have any hesitant to do something more. But at the same time, China also will take care about its relations with the United States. So far, indeed, it's a very, very complicated situation for this big powers relations between China, Russia, United States, and Europe. Certainly, I think once there are some kind of a package of solutions to get, the general, favorable environment for every major players, I think that could be welcomed by China. But of course, I think that not only China will try to play more active role, just to do something like European side say that you just give a phone call to President Putin. I don't think it's just a way of China would like to do. I think China is looking for this kind of a balance of a short-term solution and a long-term, construction, especially in the frame of European security architecture. So on this regard, I don't think China is also in favor of this kind of temporary or even a dirty treaty, just like our European friends mentioned. I think that China also is looking for long-term solutions, not only just a ceasefire between two sides, and also the healthy and sustainable security structure between Europe and Russia.
And Russia. Peter, Professor Kuznick, here, of course, there are reports of, Trump himself talked about having China to help him on the Ukraine issue. But then, some people in China would say, why should we help the U.S.? After they finish the business in Ukraine, they would completely focus on containing China. People would say it's simply not justifiable to do anything probably in that regard. What do you make of that?
The Rand Corporation issued a report titled Avoiding a Prolonged War. And it was about the reasons why the U.S. should not get involved in Ukraine on a long-term basis, because all the weapons the U.S. is supplying to Ukraine could instead be going to Taiwan. They argue that the U.S. is 4 years behind its arms deliveries to Taiwan. And since that's the real goal, the real focus of American policy, and has been since 2011, when Hillary Clinton and Obama announced the Asia pivot, they see what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in Gaza as a distraction from what America's real priority should be, which is containing China. Now, China has been constructive in a lot of ways. Lula and Xi Jinping issued that 12-point peace plan. Point number one was stressing the importance of national sovereignty, which is a critique of the Russian invasion. Point number two said no nation's national security should be achieved at the expense of other nations' national security, which was a critique of the U.S., Ukraine, and NATO. So China has been somewhat of a balancing force. But since the country that's trying to contain and limit and effectively defeat in superpower competition, China is the United States, China has been happy to cozy up to a certain degree to Russia. And so we've got the BRICS formation, which also includes India and South Africa, and China and Russia, as a counterpole to the U.S. NATO domination. But key to remember is that the global economy is shifting. I don't know the exact figures, but Europe accounts for something like 17% of global GDP. And by the end of the decade, it's estimated and probably down to about 13%. Asia represents more than 50%. So the center of the world economy and the future is really much more about Asia than about the Middle East and Europe. And the Americans understand that, and they're trying to, therefore, remain the dominant force in the Pacific, but they're up against great odds there and would be much better off finding a way to cooperate in everybody's interest than trying to dominate the region through all these military alliances that they've been doing and security pacts. So I think that where's Trump going to come out on this? I'm not optimistic, but it's possible that he'll look to make some deals rather than continue the approach that Biden took, which was to try to dominate in the region.
On that note, we are coming to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.